1 month after our divorce, he married the woman he cheated with, and she quit her nursing job because he promised to take care of her forever, just like he told me in 2016. I'm Rebecca Fletcher, 34 years old, and I spent the last 8 years building a life with a man who threw it away for someone he met during my mother's final hospital stay. The Instagram post appeared on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports at my office. There they were, Kevin Bennett and Jessica Ashford, now Jessica Bennett, standing on a Hawaiian beach at sunset, her left hand prominently displayed, showing off a ring that looked suspiciously like an upgrade of the one he'd given me. The caption made my coffee taste like acid. Finally married my forever person. She believed in our love enough to leave everything behind. Real love requires real sacrifice. 347 likes. Comments gushing about true love conquering all and following your heart. My former mother-in-law had commented with 3 heart emojis. The same woman who'd held my hand at my mother's funeral and called me her daughter. I set down my phone carefully, aware that my assistant could see me through the glass wall of my office. Rebecca Fletcher, VP of Operations at Morrison Healthcare Solutions, does not have public meltdowns. Rebecca Fletcher, who'd built her career while her husband played video games and complained about his stressful pharmaceutical sales job, does not give people the satisfaction. But Rebecca Fletcher, who'd spent the past 6 months meticulously documenting every financial discrepancy and legal vulnerability in her ex-husband's life, does smile. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder I'd been maintaining since the day I'd found the texts between Kevin and Jessica on his iPad. Not the sexual texts, those came later. The first ones I'd found were from February, while my mother was still in the ICU. "Your wife seems really cold," Jessica had written. "She barely even thanks you for being there." Kevin's response, "She's always been like that. Career obsessed. I think she actually resents that I'm not as ambitious as her." This while I was signing DNR papers and arranging hospice care. The affair had started sometime between my mother's diagnosis in January and her death in March. Kevin had been so attentive during those months, driving me to the hospital, bringing me food, rubbing my shoulders while I cried. What I didn't know was that he was also texting with the night shift nurse who'd complimented his dedication, who'd told him how rare it was to see a husband so supportive, who'd started taking her breaks when he arrived. I'd found out in the worst possible way. 4 months after Mom's funeral, I'd borrowed Kevin's iPad to look up a recipe. An iMessage notification had popped up. "Can't wait to feel you inside me again. This weekend?" It was 3 p.m. on a Wednesday. We'd had a work dinner scheduled for that Saturday. Or rather, I thought we did. The conversation history had made me physically ill. Messages going back to March, right after Mom's death. "Finally have time to focus on us," he'd written. "She's been so wrapped up in grief. She hasn't even noticed I'm gone half the time." They'd been sleeping together for months in his car, in her apartment, once in a hotel room he'd charged to our joint credit card as a business expense. But Kevin had made a crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the woman he'd married, assuming that the grief-stricken version of me would simply accept this betrayal and go quietly. He'd forgotten that I'd graduated top of my class from Ohio State's business program while working 2 jobs. He'd forgotten that I'd built my career analyzing complex financial systems and finding inefficiencies. He'd forgotten that my mother, in her final lucid days, had looked me in the eye and said, "Baby, if anyone ever hurts you, don't just survive it. Make them understand exactly what they lost." I'd filed for divorce the next day, hired the most aggressive attorney in Columbus, and began what Kevin's lawyer would later call an unnecessarily antagonistic approach to asset division. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just dividing assets. I was building something else entirely. Kevin had fought the divorce initially, crying and begging, claiming it was just a mistake and he'd never meant for it to happen. But Jessica was already pregnant by then. That detail came out during mediation, and whatever guilt he felt evaporated when he realized he could play the victim. "She's punishing me for finding real love," he told our marriage counselor during our one and only session. "She's always been vindictive when she doesn't get her way." The divorce had been finalized 2 months ago. Kevin got the house. He'd wanted to fight me for it, but I'd let him have it surprisingly easily, something his lawyer had found suspicious. He got his car, his pension, and his freedom. I got my retirement accounts, the beach condo I'd purchased in my name only, and something far more valuable: complete documentation of his financial improprieties. Because Kevin wasn't just a cheating husband. Kevin was a pharmaceutical sales representative who'd been falsifying his expense reports for 3 years. Kevin had been accepting kickbacks from doctors who overprescribed his company's medications. Kevin had been living beyond his means by stealing from his employer, and he'd been stupid enough to brag about it in text messages to his mistress. Messages I'd downloaded before he'd thought to delete them. And now, 1 month after our divorce was final, Kevin had just made his biggest mistake yet. He'd married Jessica, making her legally liable for debts he was about to acquire. He'd encouraged her to quit her job, eliminating her independent income. He'd posted about his Hawaiian honeymoon on social media, demonstrating expenditures that would look very suspicious to the FBI agents who were currently building a case against him. I picked up my phone and composed a text to the federal prosecutor who'd reached out to me 2 months ago when I'd initially made the report. Subject just returned from Hawaii. Marriage license filed last week. New wife unemployed. Timeline aligns with financial irregularities discussed. Ready to provide testimony when needed. His response came in under a minute. Grand jury convening next month. You'll need to testify. Are you prepared for what this means for your ex-husband? I looked again at the Instagram post, at Kevin's smug smile, at Jessica's blissfully ignorant expression, at the ring that had probably been purchased with embezzled funds. I thought about my mother, dying in a hospital bed while her son-in-law flirted with her nurse. I thought about the 8 years I'd wasted on a man who'd seen my grief as an inconvenience and my success as an insult. Absolutely prepared, I typed back. He promised to take care of her forever. Let's see how that works out. The federal investigation into Kevin's pharmaceutical company had begun 6 months before I'd even filed for divorce. I hadn't known about it initially. The FBI doesn't exactly announce their ongoing cases. What I did know was that Kevin had been coming home stressed, drinking more, and spending hours on encrypted messaging apps that he thought I couldn't access. I'd discovered the extent of his fraud almost by accident. In January, while dealing with my mother's medical bills, I'd noticed irregular charges on our joint credit card, business dinners that cost $800, hotel rooms in cities where Kevin claimed he'd stayed with college friends, expensive gifts that never appeared in our home. When I'd confronted him, he'd smoothly explained that his company reimbursed everything, that pharmaceutical sales required wining and dining doctors, that I clearly didn't understand how his industry worked. But I did understand numbers, and the numbers didn't add up. So I'd started documenting everything, every suspicious charge, every cash withdrawal, every weekend trip that didn't match his stated itinerary. I'd created a spreadsheet that would have made my business school professors proud. Dates, amounts, stated purposes versus actual activities, discrepancies between what he claimed as business expenses and what appeared to be personal spending. The real breakthrough came in April, a month after my mother's funeral, when Kevin had left his laptop open while taking a shower. His email was displaying, and there, right at the top, was a message from a Dr. Richard Morrison. Per our discussion, I've increased Vexinol prescriptions by 40% this quarter. Looking forward to our golf trip to Scottsdale. Have you arranged the consulting fees we discussed? Vexinol was Kevin's company's flagship pain medication. It was also currently under FDA investigation for potentially addictive properties and side effects that the company had allegedly concealed during trials. Kevin's job was to convince doctors to prescribe it as frequently as possible. I'd taken a photo of the email with my phone, then spent the next hour going through his sent folder while he sang in the shower. What I found was systematic bribery. Kevin wasn't just buying doctors' lunches. He was paying them thousands of dollars in consulting fees for prescribing quotas. He was arranging luxury vacations disguised as medical conferences. He was falsifying continuing education credits. He was, in essence, paying doctors to prescribe a potentially dangerous medication to patients who might not need it. The ethical implications made me sick. The legal implications made me strategic. I'd contacted a federal prosecutor's office through an anonymous tip line, providing just enough information to pique their interest. 2 weeks later, a special agent, Catherine Rodriguez, had called my personal cell phone. Mrs. Bennett, we'd like to speak with you about your husband's business activities. The meeting had taken place in a deliberately generic office building downtown. Agent Rodriguez was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-30s, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything about me in the first 30 seconds. Her partner, Agent Michael Chen, was older, more relaxed, playing the good cop to her intensity. We've been investigating Vanguard Pharmaceuticals for 18 months, Rodriguez had explained, sliding a folder across the table. We have evidence of a widespread scheme to bribe healthcare providers for prescription quotas. Your husband's name has come up repeatedly in our investigation. I'd opened the folder carefully. Inside were bank records, email printouts, surveillance photos. One showed Kevin having dinner with Dr. Morrison at an expensive steakhouse. Another showed him handing an envelope to a different doctor in a parking garage. The dates matched entries in my own spreadsheet. How much do you know about your husband's professional activities? Chen had asked gently. I know he's been falsifying expense reports, I'd replied, pulling out my own documentation. I know he's been accepting payments from doctors that don't show up on any legitimate tax forms. I know he's been spending money we don't have on a lifestyle that doesn't match his actual salary. Rodriguez had studied my spreadsheet, her expression shifting from professional interest to something like respect. This is remarkably detailed work, Mrs. Bennett. How long have you been compiling this? 3 months. Since I found out he was having an affair with a nurse he met while my mother was dying. The two agents had exchanged glances. Chen had leaned forward. Mrs. Bennett, what we're about to ask you is completely voluntary, but if you're willing to cooperate with our investigation, your documentation could be extremely valuable. Your testimony could be even more so. What would cooperation entail? I'd asked, though I already knew I was going to agree to whatever they asked. Primarily, we'd need you to testify before a grand jury about your observations of your husband's spending patterns and business practices. We'd also need access to any joint financial records, emails, or communications that might demonstrate his criminal activity. In exchange, we'd offer you complete immunity from any charges related to shared accounts or property. I'd smiled then, the first real smile I'd managed since discovering Kevin's betrayal. I want him prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, not because he cheated on me, that's personal, but because he's been helping drug companies push potentially dangerous medications on vulnerable patients for profit. My mother died in pain because her doctors were afraid to prescribe adequate pain management, and my husband was out there bribing other doctors to overprescribe the exact medication she needed but couldn't get. There's something else you should know, Rodriguez had added, her voice careful. When we prosecute cases like this, we don't just go after the individual. We go after anyone who benefited from the criminal proceeds. If your husband has been using embezzled funds to support a lifestyle, anyone who shares that lifestyle could potentially face charges as an accomplice. The implications had been crystal clear. Even a spouse? Even a spouse, especially if that spouse had reason to know the funds were illegally obtained. Rodriguez had paused. Of course, if you're divorcing him and you cooperate with our investigation, that changes things significantly. I'd filed for divorce the next day. Now, 2 months after the divorce was final, I sat in my office reviewing the timeline. The grand jury was convening in 3 weeks. Kevin had just returned from an expensive Hawaiian honeymoon, posted evidence of his lavish lifestyle all over social media, and legally tied himself to a woman who had no idea what was coming. My phone rang. Agent Rodriguez's number flashed on the screen. "Mrs. Fletcher," she said, using my restored maiden name with what sounded like approval. "Just wanted to update you on the timeline. We'll need you to testify on the 15th. The grand jury is looking at RICO charges, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Your ex-husband isn't just facing fraud charges anymore. We're building a case that Vanguard Pharmaceuticals operated as a criminal enterprise, and your husband was a key participant." RICO? I'd done enough corporate law research to know that RICO charges were devastating. What kind of sentence are we looking at? If convicted on all counts, 20 to 30 years federal prison, plus massive fines, asset forfeiture, and permanent prohibition from working in healthcare or pharmaceuticals. His wife would also potentially face charges as an accessory if we can prove she knowingly benefited from the criminal proceeds. I thought about Jessica's Instagram post, her casual mention of quitting her nursing job, her expensive ring, her Hawaiian honeymoon. She just quit her job, posted about it online, said her husband promised to take care of her forever. Rodriguez's laugh was sharp. Did she? That's unfortunate for her. We monitor social media very carefully in these cases. Displays of wealth and lifestyle can be powerful evidence of knowing participation in criminal activity. When will you execute the arrest warrant? That depends on the grand jury, but likely within a week of their decision. We're coordinating with the DEA and FDA as well. This case has implications beyond just fraud. Some of the medications your husband pushed have resulted in patient deaths and addictions. The U.S. attorney wants to make an example of this case. After Rodriguez hung up, I turned to my computer and pulled up Kevin's social media again. He'd been posting prolifically since returning from Hawaii. Photos of their new home. The house I'd let him keep in the divorce. The house that was probably purchased partly with embezzled funds. Photos of expensive dinners, new cars, gifts for Jessica. Every post was evidence. Every display of wealth was another nail in his coffin. My office phone rang. My assistant's voice came through. "Rebecca, your 2 o'clock is here." The reporter from Columbus Business Journal? I'd almost forgotten. I'd agreed to this interview weeks ago, before Kevin's remarriage, before I'd known the exact timeline of his arrest. The reporter wanted to talk about my recent promotion to VP of Operations, my strategies for success in a male-dominated industry, my advice for women navigating career and personal challenges. "Send her in," I said, straightening my blazer and checking my reflection in my computer screen. The reporter, Amanda Sterling, was mid-40s, professionally dressed, carrying a recorder and notepad. She'd done her research. I could tell by the intelligent questions she asked about Morrison Healthcare Solutions' recent expansion, our new contracts, my vision for the department. 20 minutes into the interview, she shifted gears. "I hope you don't mind me asking something more personal, but I noticed from public records that you recently finalized a divorce. As a successful woman in business, how do you balance career advancement with personal relationships? Did your career contribute to the dissolution of your marriage?" I could have deflected, should have deflected, but something about the question, the subtle implication that my success had caused my marriage to fail, triggered something cold and calculated in me. Actually, Amanda, my career had nothing to do with my divorce, except that it taught me to recognize patterns and discrepancies. My marriage ended because my husband was having an affair with a nurse he met while my mother was dying in the hospital. He remarried her last month, 1 month after our divorce was final. Amanda's professional mask slipped slightly, her expression shifting to sympathetic interest. That must have been devastating. It was clarifying, I corrected. Sometimes losing something shows you what you actually had, or didn't have. My ex-husband is currently under federal investigation for pharmaceutical fraud. He's been bribing doctors to overprescribe potentially dangerous medications. I discovered this while managing my mother's end-of-life care and dealing with the medical system's failures. So no, my career didn't end my marriage. My ex-husband's criminal activity and infidelity ended my marriage. My career is what gave me the skills to recognize what he was doing and the strength to walk away. Amanda had stopped taking notes, her recorder still running. Is this on the record? Absolutely, I said, meeting her eyes steadily. In fact, I think it's important for women to understand that sometimes the failure of a relationship isn't a reflection of our inadequacy. Sometimes it's evidence of our partner's character. And sometimes walking away is the most powerful thing we can do. The interview wrapped up shortly after, Amanda promising to send me a draft before publication. As she left, I saw her immediately pull out her phone in the elevator, already texting someone. Probably her editor, already reframing this from a career success piece into something far more dramatic. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Jessica Bennett. We need to talk about what you're doing to Kevin. He's a good man who made a mistake. Why are you trying to destroy his life? I stared at the message for a long moment, considering my options. I could ignore it, I could block the number, or I could give Jessica exactly what she'd asked for. Jessica, I typed back, Kevin isn't under investigation because of me. He's under investigation because he committed federal crimes. The FBI doesn't build cases on ex-wives' vindictiveness. They build them on evidence. Maybe you should ask your new husband about his consulting arrangements with Dr. Morrison, or about the envelope full of cash I have photos of him delivering, or about the expense reports he's been falsifying for 3 years. I didn't destroy Kevin's life. Kevin destroyed Kevin's life. I just documented it. Her response came immediately. You're lying. Kevin would never do anything illegal. You're just bitter because he found real love. I'm sure the federal prosecutors will be interested in your testimony, I replied. See you at the trial. I blocked the number and returned to work, but my mind was already 3 weeks ahead, imagining the moment when Kevin's carefully constructed new life would collapse around him. When Jessica would realize that the man who'd promised to take care of her forever couldn't even take care of himself. When the Instagram posts and expensive gifts and promises of eternal love would be revealed as nothing more than the last desperate gasps of a man who'd built everything on lies. My mother's voice echoed in my memory. Baby, if anyone ever hurts you, don't just survive it. Make them understand exactly what they lost. Kevin was about to understand exactly what he'd lost, and exactly what he'd never deserved in the first place. The 3 weeks before my grand jury testimony passed in a blur of preparation and strategic positioning. Agent Rodriguez had been thorough. We'd met 4 times to review my evidence, rehearse my testimony, and ensure I understood the scope of the case. Each meeting revealed new layers of Kevin's criminal activity that I hadn't even suspected. Your ex-husband wasn't just bribing doctors, Rodriguez explained during our 3rd meeting, spreading out new documents on the conference table. He was part of a nationwide network. Vanguard Pharmaceuticals had a systematic operation across 12 states. They called it the Prescriber Enhancement Program. Internal documents we've seized literally referred to doctors as assets and patients as revenue streams. She showed me emails I'd never seen before. Communications between Kevin and his regional manager. We need to push Vexanol harder in Ohio. One read. Morrison is performing well, patient conversion rate of 78%. Bennett, can you identify 3 more high-volume prescribers in Columbus Metro? Usual incentive structure applies. What's the usual incentive structure? I asked, though I suspected I knew. $5,000 per quarter for meeting prescription quotas, $10,000 for exceeding them. All expense-paid medical conferences in luxury resorts, which were really just vacation packages with one brief presentation. Kevin's personal take over the past 3 years, approximately $400,000 in unreported income. The number stunned me. $400,000. I'd been working 60-hour weeks, fighting for every promotion, carefully managing our budget, while Kevin had been pocketing nearly his entire legitimate salary as pure profit, because his actual income was coming from bribes. The house you let him keep in the divorce, Rodriguez continued, purchased partly with those funds. The car he drives, financed with embezzled money. Even the engagement ring he gave his new wife. We've traced the purchase to a credit card he opened using a fake business entity. Can you recover any of that? I asked. Oh, we're going to recover all of it. Asset forfeiture laws are very clear. When property is purchased with proceeds from criminal activity, it can be seized by the government. The house, the cars, the jewelry, all of it. His new wife is going to lose everything he's given her. A small, vindictive part of me felt satisfaction at that prospect. But the larger part, the part that had spent months working with prosecutors, felt something more complex. This wasn't just about Kevin getting punished for cheating on me. This was about accountability for a system that had valued profit over patient welfare. Tell me about the patients, I said quietly, the ones who were affected by this. Rodriguez's expression darkened. She pulled out another folder, this one containing medical records and death certificates. Vexanol is an opioid-based pain medication. Vanguard knew it had a high addiction potential. Their own internal studies showed it, but they buried that research and pushed doctors to prescribe it for moderate pain conditions where it wasn't necessary. We've documented at least 47 overdose deaths directly linked to Vexanol prescriptions written by doctors Kevin bribed. The weight of that number hit me physically. 47 people. 47 families who'd lost someone because Kevin wanted a bigger house and a Hawaiian honeymoon. One of them was a 16-year-old girl in Dayton, Rodriguez continued, her voice tight with controlled anger. Prescribed Vexanol for a sports injury. Dead from an overdose 8 months later. Her mother is prepared to testify at trial about how the doctor, one of Kevin's enhanced prescribers, dismissed her concerns about addiction risk and kept increasing the dosage. I thought about my mother, struggling with inadequate pain management at the end of her life because doctors were rightfully afraid of opioid prescriptions. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. While she was dying in undertreated agony, Kevin was pushing doctors to overprescribe the exact medications she needed but couldn't get. I want to testify about that, I said. About my mother's experience. About the systemic failure of pain management that makes cases like this possible. Rodriguez nodded slowly. The prosecutors are actually hoping you'll do that. Your testimony isn't just about Kevin's financial crimes, it's about humanizing the impact. You're a successful businesswoman with no criminal record, a mother who died in pain, a wife who was betrayed while grieving. You're the perfect witness to show the jury exactly who gets hurt by this kind of corruption. The media attention intensified as the grand jury date approached. Amanda Sterling's article in Columbus Business Journal had been picked up by larger outlets. Local executive exposes ex-husband's alleged pharmaceutical fraud, ran in the Columbus Dispatch. VP credits career skills for uncovering federal investigation, appeared in Cleveland Plain Dealer. My inbox flooded with interview requests, book deal inquiries, and messages from strangers sharing their own stories of pharmaceutical industry abuses. I declined most interviews, but I did agree to speak with a healthcare reform advocacy group that wanted to feature my story in their campaign for prescription transparency. Kevin's response was predictable. His lawyer issued a statement claiming I was a vindictive ex-wife attempting to destroy her former husband's reputation through false accusations. He denied all wrongdoing, insisted the FBI investigation was based on misunderstandings and misinterpretations, and claimed he was a victim of a corrupted legal system influenced by a vengeful woman. The statement backfired spectacularly. Within hours, other Vanguard sales representatives began coming forward with information about the company's practices. One former colleague contacted the FBI hotline and provided evidence that Kevin had actually trained new hires in how to structure incentive arrangements to avoid detection. Another shared emails showing Kevin had laughed about doctors who were stupid enough to actually believe Vexanol wasn't addictive. Jessica had gone silent on social media after my conversation with her, but I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd hired a lawyer. Smart move, considering what was coming. Her attorney had apparently advised her to distance herself from Kevin's defense, cooperate with investigators, and prepare for the possibility of losing everything her new husband had given her. 2 days before the grand jury testimony, I received an unexpected call from Kevin's mother, Patricia Bennett. We'd always had a cordial relationship. She'd been warm and welcoming when Kevin and I married, supportive during my mother's illness. She'd called me her daughter at family gatherings, included me in holiday planning, treated me like the child she'd never had alongside her son. Rebecca, she said when I answered, her voice thick with emotion. I need to speak with you. Please, can we meet in person? Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a quiet coffee shop near her home in Dublin, a suburb northwest of Columbus. Patricia arrived looking 10 years older than the last time I'd seen her, at Kevin's wedding to Jessica, where she'd ignored me completely. I owe you an apology, she said immediately, before even ordering coffee. Several apologies. Actually, I chose my son over you when he cheated. I attended his wedding to that woman barely a month after your divorce. I believed his lies about you being vindictive and unreasonable. I should have known better. I didn't respond immediately, letting her continue. Kevin called me yesterday, Patricia went on, her hands shaking slightly. He's terrified about this investigation. He told me everything, the bribes, the falsified reports, all of it. He said he's going to go to prison, that they're going to take his house, that Jessica is going to leave him. And Rebecca, I need you to understand something. I don't blame you for any of this. Patricia? No, let me finish. She took a deep breath. I raised a man who thought rules didn't apply to him, who thought charm could substitute for character, who believed he deserved whatever he wanted without having to earn it. I watched him treat you like an accessory to his life instead of a partner. I saw how hard you worked while he coasted. I knew he wasn't good enough for you, but I told myself it was none of my business because he was my son. Tears were streaming down her face now, and despite everything, I felt a pang of sympathy for her. She hadn't committed Kevin's crimes, hadn't betrayed me personally. When you found out he was cheating, I should have supported you, Patricia continued. I should have told him he was throwing away the best thing in his life. Instead, I made excuses for him. I told myself that marriages are complicated, that you were too focused on your career, that maybe he'd made a mistake, but deserved forgiveness. He didn't just make a mistake, I said quietly. He systematically chose to prioritize his own pleasure and profit over ethics, legality, and basic human decency. He hurt people, Patricia. Real people. A 16-year-old girl is dead because a Dr. Kevin bribed prescribed medication she didn't need. Patricia's face crumpled. I know. The FBI came to interview me last week. They showed me things, emails, evidence. They asked if Kevin had displayed sudden wealth, if I'd noticed expensive purchases. And Rebecca? I had noticed. But I told myself he was just doing well in his career, that pharmaceutical sales paid better than I'd realized. I didn't want to see what was really happening. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I need you to know that whatever happens at that grand jury, whatever testimony you give, I support you. I won't try to defend Kevin anymore. He made his choices, and he needs to face the consequences. She reached across the table and took my hand, and I need you to know that I'm sorry for not seeing you as you were. Brilliant, loyal, decent. For choosing the wrong side when my son betrayed you. For attending that mockery of a wedding when I should have been mourning the loss of my daughter-in-law. I squeezed her hand briefly before withdrawing. Patricia, I appreciate this, but you should know that my testimony isn't motivated by anger at Kevin for cheating. It's motivated by what he did to vulnerable patients, by the systematic corruption I discovered, by the fact that my mother died in inadequate pain management, while Kevin was pushing doctors to overprescribe those same medications for profit. I know, she said, and that's exactly why you're doing the right thing. We talked for another hour, Patricia sharing her own grief about losing the image she'd held of her son, her fear for his future, her shame at having enabled his behavior through years of excuses. By the end, I felt a strange sense of closure. Not forgiveness for Kevin, but an understanding that his betrayals had rippled outward, hurting people who'd loved him genuinely. The night before my testimony, Tyler came over to my new apartment with takeout and moral support. We'd been dating for 6 months now, a relationship that had grown carefully from friendship during my divorce into something deeper. He'd never pushed, never tried to rescue me, simply been present and supportive while I rebuilt my life. Are you nervous about tomorrow? He asked as we ate Thai food on my balcony, watching the Columbus skyline light up against the evening sky. Surprisingly, no, I admitted. I'm prepared. I know what I need to say, and I know it's the truth. Have you thought about what happens after? Tyler asked carefully. After Kevin is indicted, after the trial, the media attention isn't going to disappear immediately. I've already had 3 job offers from healthcare companies that want to hire me for compliance positions, I said with a slight laugh. Apparently, uncovered major pharmaceutical fraud looks good on a resume, but I'm staying at Morrison. I like my work, I like my team, and I'm not going to let Kevin's crimes dictate my career trajectory. Tyler smiled. That's very you, refusing to let anyone else write your story. My mother taught me that, I said softly. Even at the end, even when she was in so much pain, she stayed fierce. The last real conversation we had, she told me that surviving wasn't enough. She wanted me to thrive. She wanted me to refuse to be diminished by anyone or anything. I think she knew somehow that I was going to need that lesson. She'd be proud of you, Tyler said. I hope so. The next morning dawned clear and cold, a crisp November day that felt appropriately stark for what was ahead. I dressed carefully in a navy suit that projected authority without aggression, professional credibility without ostentation. Agent Rodriguez had coached me on everything from wardrobe to body language. Grand jury proceedings were serious, and every detail mattered. The federal courthouse in downtown Columbus was imposing, all granite and glass and the weight of institutional justice. Rodriguez met me at the security entrance, along with Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Hall, who would be presenting the case to the grand jury. Mrs. Fletcher, Hall greeted me, shaking my hand firmly. Thank you for being here. Your testimony is crucial to establishing the timeline and pattern of Kevin Bennett's criminal activity. The grand jury has already heard from FBI agents, forensic accountants, and several doctors who were approached by your ex-husband. Your testimony will connect those individual incidents into a coherent narrative of systematic corruption. I'm ready, I said, and I meant it. The grand jury room was smaller than I'd expected, less theatrical than the courtrooms shown in movies. 23 citizens sat in tiered rows, their faces reflecting various levels of attention and curiosity. There was no judge, no defense attorney, just the grand jury, the prosecutors, and me. I was sworn in, confirmed my identity, and began answering questions. Hall led me through the chronology methodically. My marriage to Kevin, my career advancement while he stayed in mid-level sales positions, my mother's illness and death, the discovery of Kevin's affair with Jessica, the discovery of the financial irregularities, the creation of my documentation spreadsheet. Mrs. Fletcher, Hall asked, pulling up one of Kevin's credit card statements on a large screen. Can you explain what this charge represents? I studied the entry. $400 at Morton's Steakhouse in Chicago, dated 6 months ago. That was charged to our joint credit card as a business dinner with a doctor. Kevin told me he was taking Dr. Richard Morrison and several colleagues to discuss a new medication, but when I cross-referenced the date, Kevin was actually in Columbus that night. I have a receipt from a local restaurant where he used our other credit card with Jessica. So this $8,000 charge was for what purpose? Based on the FBI's investigation, I believe it was Kevin entertaining Dr. Morrison without actually attending himself. He was essentially giving Morrison an expensive night out as part of their bribery arrangement, while having dinner locally with his girlfriend. One of the grand jurors, an older woman in the front row, leaned forward. Can I ask a question? Hall nodded. Mrs. Fletcher, did you report this suspicious activity to the credit card company or to your husband's employer when you discovered it? No, ma'am, I replied honestly. At the time, I was dealing with my mother's death and discovering my husband's infidelity. The financial irregularities seemed like a secondary concern. It wasn't until I understood the scope of what he was doing, the patient harm, the systematic corruption, that I felt compelled to contact federal authorities. Hall continued, walking me through dozens of charges, travel discrepancies, and cash withdrawals. Each one painted a picture of a man systematically defrauding his employer while bribing healthcare providers. Then Hall brought up the emails I'd discovered on Kevin's laptop. Mrs. Fletcher, can you describe the circumstances under which you accessed your husband's email? I explained carefully. The laptop left open, the visible email from Dr. Morrison, my decision to document what I'd found while Kevin was in the shower. Hall assured the grand jury that everything I'd accessed was either on shared devices or in plain view, legally permissible under spousal access rules. The emails were devastating. Kevin discussing consulting arrangements that were clearly bribes. Kevin sharing strategies for avoiding detection, using cash, routing payments through fake business entities, structuring transactions below reporting thresholds. Kevin laughing about doctors who were too stupid to realize Vexanol is basically legal heroin, and patients who were getting hooked, which means repeat prescriptions, which means more money for everyone. I watched the grand jurors' faces as each email appeared on screen. Disgust, anger, disbelief. One man in the back row was shaking his head continuously. A younger woman in the front was taking notes with increasingly aggressive pen strokes. Finally, Hall asked the question I'd been waiting for. Mrs. Fletcher, your mother died while your husband was engaged in these activities. Can you describe her end-of-life experience with pain management? I took a breath, steadying myself. My mother had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Her pain was severe, particularly in the final months. Her oncologist was extremely conservative with opioid prescriptions, rightfully so, given the addiction crisis. She was given NSAIDs, localized nerve blocks, and minimal doses of opioids that barely touched her suffering. I watched my mother cry in pain because the medical system was correctly afraid of overprescribing medications like Vexanol. My voice cracked slightly, but I pushed through. At the same time, my husband was bribing doctors to prescribe those exact medications to patients who didn't need them at those dosages. He was profiting from the overprescription of pain medication while my mother was dying in undertreated agony. The cruel irony of that still haunts me. The grand jury room was completely silent. Several jurors were visibly emotional. Hall let the moment sit before asking his final question. Mrs. Fletcher, do you believe your ex-husband should be held accountable for these activities? I believe he must be held accountable, I replied firmly, not because he betrayed me personally. That's between us, but because his actions contributed to patient harm, overdose deaths, and the systematic corruption of healthcare. The 16-year-old girl who died in Dayton deserved better. The families destroyed by addiction deserved better. My mother deserved better. And the only way to prevent this from continuing is to prosecute people like Kevin Bennett to the fullest extent of the law. When I finished testifying and was dismissed from the grand jury room, Agent Rodriguez was waiting outside with a slight smile. That was powerful testimony, she said. Some of those jurors were crying. When will they vote on the indictment? I asked. Probably within the hour. With testimony like yours, I don't think there's any question about the outcome. She was right. An hour and 15 minutes later, Marcus Hall emerged from the grand jury room with news. True bill returned on all counts. Kevin Bennett would be indicted on 47 counts of healthcare fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and money laundering. Arrest warrant to be executed within 48 hours. We're going to get him tomorrow morning, Rodriguez told me, at his home, so his wife will be present. We'll be executing search warrants simultaneously at Vanguard Pharmaceuticals headquarters and at several of the doctor's offices. This is going to be a coordinated, high-profile operation. Will you let me know when it's done? I asked. We're not supposed to update victims or witnesses on tactical operations, Rodriguez replied, then smiled. But I might accidentally text you when I'm publicly permitted to confirm arrests that have been reported in the media. I drove home in a daze, the weight of the past 6 months settling over me. Tomorrow morning, Kevin's new life would shatter. The house would be seized. The cars would be impounded. The expensive ring he'd given Jessica would be cataloged as evidence. His promises of taking care of her forever would be revealed as the empty words of a man who couldn't even take care of himself. And I would finally be able to close this chapter and move forward. My phone buzzed at 6:47 a.m. with a text from Agent Rodriguez. Operation in progress. News cameras are present as planned. You might want to check local news. I was already awake. Had been since 5:30, unable to sleep through the anticipation. I pulled up the Columbus local news website on my laptop just as the breaking news banner flashed across the top. FBI arrests local pharmaceutical executive in major fraud case. The live feed showed a suburban street I recognized immediately. The house Kevin had fought me for in the divorce. The house I'd let him have because I knew what was coming. 4 FBI vehicles were parked in the driveway. Agents in windbreakers with FBI emblazoned on the back swarming the property. News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing everything. I turned on the television to get the live audio feed. A reporter was breathlessly narrating, "We're here in Dublin, Ohio, where FBI agents are executing arrest warrants in what sources tell us is a major pharmaceutical fraud investigation. The suspect, identified as Kevin Bennett, a sales representative for Vanguard Pharmaceuticals, is alleged to have been part of a nationwide bribery scheme." The front door opened. FBI agents emerged, escorting Kevin in handcuffs, his face pale and stunned. He was still in his pajamas, hadn't even had time to dress before they'd taken him into custody. Behind him, barely visible in the doorway, stood Jessica in a robe, her expression shifting between shock and horror as she registered the cameras, the agents, the complete collapse of the life she'd thought she was stepping into. An agent I didn't recognize was speaking with her, showing her papers, probably the seizure warrant for the house and all its contents. Another agent was photographing the interior, documenting everything that would eventually be confiscated as proceeds of criminal activity. Kevin was loaded into an unmarked FBI vehicle, his head down, his shoulders hunched. The reporter continued, "Bennett's arrest is part of a larger operation targeting Vanguard Pharmaceuticals and several healthcare providers accused of accepting bribes to prescribe potentially addictive pain medications. Sources tell us the investigation was triggered in part by information provided by Bennett's ex-wife, a local business executive who discovered evidence of his criminal activity during their divorce proceedings." My phone started ringing immediately. My boss, colleagues, friends who'd seen the news. I ignored them all, transfixed by the live feed as more details emerged. 12 people arrested in coordinated raids across 3 states. Vanguard Pharmaceuticals offices raided, with agents removing boxes of documents. Dr. Richard Morrison, the doctor Kevin had bribed most extensively, being led out of his medical practice in handcuffs. The camera cut back to Kevin's house, where Jessica was now standing on the front lawn, speaking frantically with an FBI agent. Even without audio, her body language screamed panic, gesturing at the house, at her ring finger, clearly trying to understand what was happening to her life. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Tyler. I answered. "Are you watching this?" he asked without preamble. "Every second. How are you feeling?" I considered the question carefully. Satisfied, vindicated, and surprisingly sad. Sad? For Jessica, actually. She quit her job, married a man she thought would take care of her, and now she's going to lose everything and potentially face charges as an accomplice. She's not innocent. She had an affair with a married man, but I don't think she understood what she was getting into. "That's generous of you," Tyler said quietly. "It's not generosity. It's just reality. Kevin destroys everyone who gets close to him. I'm just lucky I got out before he could destroy me too." By mid-morning, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Kevin was arraigned on 47 federal counts. His bail hearing was a spectacle. Prosecutors argued he was a flight risk given the severity of the charges and the overseas bank accounts they'd discovered. His lawyer, a public defender since Kevin's expensive attorney had dropped him once the asset seizures were announced, argued weakly for house arrest. The judge set bail at $1 million, cash only, with GPS monitoring and passport surrender required. There was no way Kevin could make that bail, not with all his assets frozen. He'd be staying in federal custody pending trial. Jessica was photographed leaving the courthouse separately, her face hidden behind sunglasses and a scarf. The caption on the news website read, "Wife of accused fraudster refuses comment." I felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for her, followed immediately by the memory of her Instagram post celebrating their honeymoon while I dealt with the aftermath of my mother's death. The afternoon brought a cascade of developments. Vanguard Pharmaceuticals issued a statement claiming Kevin and others had acted independently and against company policy, trying to distance themselves from the very program their executives had designed and profited from. The FBI responded by announcing additional arrests of mid-level managers at Vanguard, making it clear the company's attempt to scapegoat individual sales reps wouldn't work. My own phone continued ringing with media requests. I'd agreed to give one interview to Amanda Sterling at Columbus Business Journal, since she'd been the first to tell part of this story. We met in my office that afternoon, with my company's PR representative present, to ensure I didn't say anything that could compromise the upcoming trial. Rebecca, can you walk me through how you felt this morning watching your ex-husband's arrest? Amanda asked, her recorder running. Honestly, I felt relief, I replied carefully. Not because I take any pleasure in Kevin's suffering, but because this means accountability. When I discovered what he was doing, the patient harm, the systematic corruption, I knew it had to be exposed. Watching the FBI take him into custody meant that justice was actually being served. Your ex-husband's attorney has suggested that you cooperated with the FBI out of vindictiveness following your divorce. How do you respond to that? I'd prepared for this question. My motivation has nothing to do with our divorce. When I discovered evidence of Kevin bribing doctors to overprescribe potentially dangerous medications, I had a moral obligation to report it. A 16-year-old girl died because of the system Kevin participated in. My own mother died in undertreated pain while Kevin profited from overprescription. This isn't about a marriage ending. It's about holding people accountable when their crimes hurt vulnerable patients. What about Jessica Bennett, Kevin's current wife? Do you feel any responsibility for her situation? This was trickier territory. Jessica made her own choices. She chose to have an affair with a married man. She chose to quit her job and become financially dependent on someone she barely knew. Those were adult decisions with adult consequences. That said, I don't take any pleasure in seeing her suffer. She's a victim of Kevin's lies too, just in a different way. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from my discovery process to my testimony to my plans for moving forward. Amanda's article would run the next day, and I knew it would be picked up nationally. I was becoming the face of whistleblowers, of scorned wives who fought back, of women who refused to be silenced or dismissed. That evening, I received an unexpected email from Patricia Bennett. Rebecca, I watched the news today with my heart breaking for multiple reasons. I'm heartbroken that my son committed these crimes, heartbroken for the patients he harmed, and heartbroken that I didn't see this coming. But I'm also grateful. Grateful that you had the courage to do what needed to be done. Grateful that you chose justice over silence. Grateful that you're the kind of person my son should have tried to be. Whatever happens at trial, know that you have my support. You've shown more integrity in the past 6 months than Kevin has shown in his entire life. Patricia. I read the email 3 times, then saved it in a folder I'd created called Closure. It wasn't forgiveness for Kevin. That would never come. But it was acknowledgement from his own mother that what I'd done was right. My phone buzzed with another news alert. Vanguard Pharmaceuticals CEO resigns amid FBI investigation. The dominoes were falling faster than anyone had anticipated. The CEO's resignation was followed by an emergency board meeting, then an announcement that the company was suspending all sales operations pending a complete internal review. By nightfall, the story had gone national. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, all covering the opioid corruption case as it was being called. My name was mentioned in every article, sometimes with my photo from the Business Journal piece. I was being called brave, vindictive, a whistleblower, a scorned woman seeking revenge. The narratives overlapped and contradicted each other, but the facts remained consistent. Kevin had committed federal crimes, I'd provided evidence, and now he was facing decades in prison. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony, watching the sun set over Columbus. This morning, Kevin had woken up in his expensive house, in his new marriage, believing he'd gotten away with everything. By tonight, he was in federal custody, his assets seized, his wife panicking, his future demolished. But this wasn't my victory. Not really. The victory belonged to the families who would see justice for their loved ones, who died or been harmed. The victory belonged to the patients who would be protected because the system had finally held someone accountable. The victory belonged to my mother, who taught me that surviving wasn't enough. You had to thrive, and you had to fight. My phone rang one more time. Tyler, checking in again. Dinner? He asked simply. I thought you'd never ask, I replied. As I got ready to meet him, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me was stronger than the one who'd found those devastating texts on Kevin's iPad 6 months ago. Stronger than the grieving daughter who'd buried her mother while her husband betrayed her. Stronger than the person who'd believed that family loyalty meant accepting poor treatment. This woman had dismantled a criminal enterprise. This woman had testified against corruption. This woman had refused to be silenced or dismissed or destroyed. Kevin had promised to take care of Jessica forever. Instead, within 1 month of their marriage, he'd been arrested, his assets seized, his freedom stripped away. His promises had been revealed as the worthless words of a man who couldn't even take care of himself, much less anyone else. And I had kept the only promise that mattered, the one I'd made to my mother, to myself, to refuse to be diminished by anyone or anything. Tomorrow would bring more news coverage, more legal proceedings, more consequences for Kevin and Vanguard Pharmaceuticals. But tonight, I would have dinner with someone who'd chosen to stand beside me without trying to diminish me, who'd supported my pursuit of justice without trying to redirect it, who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let wrongdoing go unchallenged. Kevin's arrest was just the beginning. The trial would take months, maybe years, but the outcome was already clear. Justice wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. And Kevin Bennett was about to learn exactly what accountability meant. The trial began 4 months after Kevin's arrest, on a gray March morning that felt appropriate for the gravity of what was about to unfold. Federal Courthouse, downtown Columbus, with a media circus outside that had been building for weeks. I'd been subpoenaed to testify for the prosecution, which meant I'd be one of the final witnesses, the government saving their most compelling narrative for near the end. Agent Rodriguez had warned me that Kevin's defense would try to paint me as the vindictive ex-wife orchestrating his downfall out of spite. Let them, I'd replied. The evidence doesn't care about their narrative. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. For 3 weeks, Assistant U.S. Attorney Marcus Hall walked the jury through Kevin's crimes with forensic precision. FBI forensic accountants testified about the money trail, $400,000 in bribes, laundered through fake consulting businesses and offshore accounts. They showed spreadsheets documenting every payment, every kickback, every fraudulent expense report. Dr. Richard Morrison testified under a plea agreement, describing how Kevin had approached him 5 years ago with a simple proposition: prescribe more Vexanol. Get paid in cash, no questions asked. Morrison's testimony was clinical, detached, as though he was describing someone else's crimes. But the jury watched him with unconcealed disgust as he admitted to accepting over $200,000 in bribes and consulting fees over 3 years. Did you consider the patient welfare implications of overprescribing Vexanol? Hall asked. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. I told myself I was providing pain relief, that the patients needed it. Did they need it? Not always. Not at those dosages. Did you know that Vexanol had a high addiction potential? Yes. Did you disclose that risk to patients? Not adequately. The prosecution presented testimony from family members of patients who died. The mother of the 16-year-old girl from Dayton took the stand, her grief raw and visceral even 2 years after her daughter's death. She described how Dr. Morrison had prescribed Vexanol for a minor sports injury, how the dosage had increased over months, how her daughter had become addicted, how she'd overdosed in their bathroom while her mother was making dinner downstairs. Did Dr. Morrison ever discuss addiction risk with you or your daughter? Hall asked gently. Never, she replied, tears streaming. He said it was safe. He said athletes use it all the time for injuries. He never mentioned addiction. He never warned us. The courtroom was silent except for her crying. I glanced at the jury. 3 women were openly weeping. The jury foreman, a middle-aged man in a suit, was staring at Kevin with an expression of pure hatred. Kevin's defense attorney, Gerald Whitmore, was expensive and aggressive. He'd been hired with money from Kevin's parents, who'd taken out a second mortgage on their home to afford his fees. Whitmore's strategy was to argue that Kevin had been following company policy, that Vanguard Pharmaceuticals had created the Prescriber Enhancement Program, and Kevin was just doing his job. My client is a scapegoat, Whitmore argued in his opening statement, a mid-level employee being sacrificed to protect the executives who designed this system. Kevin Bennett followed the training he received, executed the strategies his managers taught him, and now he's being held responsible for corporate decisions made far above his pay grade. It might have been a compelling argument if the prosecution hadn't already presented emails showing Kevin enthusiastically embracing the bribery scheme, joking about patients getting addicted, and actively training other sales reps in how to avoid detection. The jury had seen Kevin's own words. The key is making them think it's their idea to prescribe more. Give them the consulting opportunity. Let them rationalize it as legitimate business, and boom, instant revenue stream. When my turn to testify came on day 17 of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Media, spectators, Kevin's family, Jessica sitting in the back row looking gaunt and haunted. Tyler had taken the day off to be there, sitting in the gallery where I could see him if I needed a supportive face. I was sworn in, confirmed my identity, and prepared for what I knew would be an ordeal. Hall led me through the same chronology I'd presented to the grand jury, but with more detail and more personal impact. My marriage to Kevin, my career advancement, my mother's illness and death, the discovery of the affair, the discovery of the financial crimes. Mrs. Fletcher, can you describe your mother's experience with pain management during her terminal illness? Hall asked. I'd prepared for this question, but it still hit me emotionally. My mother had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Her pain was severe and constant. Her oncologist was extremely conservative with opioid prescriptions because of legitimate concerns about addiction and side effects. She was given NSAIDs, over-the-counter pain medication essentially, and minimal opioids that barely controlled her suffering. I watched my mother cry in pain, unable to sleep, unable to eat, because the medical system was rightfully cautious about over-prescribing pain medication. And at the same time, What was your husband doing? Kevin was bribing doctors to overprescribe those exact medications to patients who didn't need them at those dosages. He was profiting from the overprescription of opioids while my mother was dying in undertreated agony. Hall pulled up an email on the screen, one I'd provided from Kevin's laptop. Can you explain what this email represents? The email was from Kevin to another sales rep, dated 2 weeks after my mother's death. Just closed Morrison for another quarter. Guy's a gold mine. Writes Vexenol scripts like candy. His patient retention rate is insane because half of them are hooked. LOL. Meanwhile, my MIL just died and my wife is losing it over how she didn't get enough pain meds. The irony is not lost on me. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The judge gavelled for silence. I felt physically sick rereading Kevin's words. His callous dismissal of my mother's suffering, his awareness that he was profiting from addiction, his complete lack of remorse. How did you feel when you discovered this email? Hall asked, devastated, betrayed, and then angry. Because it meant Kevin knew exactly what he was doing. He knew patients were becoming addicted. He knew the system was failing people like my mother, and he didn't care because he was making money. Whitmore's cross-examination was brutal, but predictable. He tried to establish that I was motivated by revenge for Kevin's affair, that my cooperation with the FBI was vindictive rather than principled, that I'd selectively provided evidence to make Kevin look worse than he was. Mrs. Fletcher? Isn't it true that you were angry about your husband's infidelity? Whitmore asked. Yes. And you wanted to punish him for that infidelity? I wanted him held accountable for federal crimes. But the timing is suspicious, isn't it? You discovered his affair in April and you contacted the FBI in May. Doesn't that suggest your motivation was personal revenge rather than concern for public welfare? I met Whitmore's eyes steadily. I discovered evidence of systematic bribery and healthcare fraud in April. I confirmed the extent of his criminal activity in May. I reported it to federal authorities because patients were being harmed. My personal feelings about his infidelity are completely separate from my moral obligation to report crimes that were killing people. You were also going through a contentious divorce at the time, correct? The divorce was contentious because Kevin refused to take responsibility for his actions. He wanted me to quietly accept his infidelity and his financial crimes. Objection. Whitmore said sharply. The witness is editorializing. Sustained, the judge replied. Mrs. Fletcher, please answer only the questions asked. Whitmore continued pressing, trying to shake my credibility, but the evidence was overwhelming. Every claim I made was backed by documents, emails, financial records. When he tried to suggest I'd fabricated the spreadsheet documenting Kevin's expenses, Hall produced my original handwritten notes with timestamps and metadata proving authenticity. After 2 hours of cross-examination, Whitmore finally gave up. No further questions. As I stepped down from the witness stand, I made brief eye contact with Kevin. For the first time since the trial began, he was looking directly at me. His expression wasn't anger or defiance. It was something closer to defeat. He knew he was going to be convicted. He knew his life was over. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, just a hollow sense of completion. This wasn't about Kevin's suffering. It was about accountability for the harm he'd caused. Jessica testified 2 days later, called by the defense in a desperate attempt to humanize Kevin. She took the stand wearing a simple dress, looking nervous and unprepared. Whitmore led her through a narrative designed to portray Kevin as a loving husband who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve decades in prison. Mrs. Bennett, can you describe your husband's character? Kevin is kind and generous, Jessica said, her voice shaking slightly. He's been supportive of me during this difficult time. He's not the monster the prosecution is making him out to be. Were you aware of any criminal activity when you began your relationship with him? No. Kevin told me he was successful in pharmaceutical sales. I had no idea about any of this until the FBI arrested him. Hall's cross-examination was surgical. Mrs. Bennett, you quit your nursing job shortly after marrying the defendant, correct? Yes. And he promised to take care of you forever? Yes. Did you wonder how a mid-level pharmaceutical sales representative could afford to support you on a single income? Purchase expensive jewelry, and take you on luxury vacations? Jessica faltered. I trusted him. He said he was doing well in his career. You're a nurse, Mrs. Bennett. You understand healthcare systems. Did you never wonder why your husband was so successful, or why he spent so much time entertaining doctors? Objection, Whitmore interjected. The witness is not on trial here. Sustained, the judge replied. But the damage was done. The jury had seen Jessica's inability to explain how she'd never questioned Kevin's wealth. Hall pressed further. Mrs. Bennett, the defendant's income was approximately $80,000 annually before bonuses. His legitimate bonuses averaged another $20,000 per year. That's $100,000 total. Yet, in the year before his arrest, he spent over $300,000. Did you never question where that money came from? I didn't manage the finances, Jessica replied weakly. Did you benefit from that money? Yes, but I didn't know it was illegal. You're wearing an engagement ring that cost $45,000. Purchased 3 weeks after the defendant finalized his divorce. Did you question how he could afford that? Jessica's face crumpled. No. The jury's expressions were merciless. They'd already convicted Kevin in their minds. Now they were extending that judgment to Jessica, who'd willingly chosen to become the wife of a man who'd abandoned his previous wife while her mother was dying. The prosecution rested after 4 weeks of testimony. Whitmore's defense was weak. Character witnesses who testified that Kevin was a good neighbor or a friendly colleague, none of whom could speak to his professional activities. An expert witness who tried to argue that pharmaceutical sales often involved aggressive marketing tactics that could be misinterpreted as bribery. The jury looked skeptical throughout. Closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon. Hall's closing was devastating, walking the jury through the evidence point by point, showing how Kevin had systematically chosen profit over patient welfare, how he'd laughed about addiction, how he'd shown no remorse even when confronted with the consequences of his actions. Kevin Bennett isn't on trial because his ex-wife was angry about infidelity, Hall concluded. He's on trial because he committed federal crimes that harmed vulnerable patients, because he corrupted healthcare providers, because he profited from addiction and death. The evidence is overwhelming. The defendant's own words condemn him, and justice demands that he be held accountable. Whitmore's closing tried valiantly to shift blame to Vanguard Pharmaceuticals, to portray Kevin as a victim of corporate culture, to suggest that everyone in the industry operated the same way. But his argument felt hollow against the weight of the evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous on all 47 counts. Guilty. Kevin's face went white. Jessica, sitting in the back of the courtroom, began crying. Patricia Bennett, Kevin's mother, sat stone-faced, her expression unreadable. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentence investigation and victim impact statements. Agent Rodriguez texted me immediately after the verdict. Justice served, sentencing in June. Maximum recommended sentence is 25 years. The media coverage was intense. Pharmaceutical fraud conviction sends message about opioid crisis, ran in the New York Times. Ex-wife's testimony seals former pharmaceutical rep's fate in Washington Post. I declined all interview requests, having said everything I needed to say. Jessica filed for divorce 3 days after the conviction. The court filings, made public record, showed she was requesting an annulment on grounds of fraud, claiming Kevin had concealed material facts about his financial situation and criminal activity. I felt a strange sympathy for her. She'd made terrible choices, but she was also Kevin's victim in her own way. Sentencing day arrived in early June, a warm morning with clear skies that felt inappropriate for the gravity of what was about to happen. The courtroom was packed again, with victims' families in the front rows, their presence a silent testament to the harm Kevin had caused. I sat in the gallery next to Tyler, my hand in his, preparing for what I knew would be emotionally difficult regardless of how justified the proceedings were. The judge, Marissa Henderson, was known for tough sentences in white-collar crime cases. She'd reviewed the pre-sentence investigation, read victim impact statements, and considered recommendations from both the prosecution and defense. "Mr. Bennett, do you wish to make a statement before sentencing?" Judge Henderson asked. Kevin stood, his prison jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits he'd worn during trial. His lawyer had clearly coached him, but whatever prepared statement he'd planned seemed to die in his throat. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry to the patients and families I hurt. I'm sorry to my ex-wife for the pain I caused her. I'm sorry to my mother. I made terrible choices, and I'll regret them for the rest of my life." Judge Henderson's expression didn't soften. "Mr. Bennett, the pre-sentence investigation reveals a disturbing pattern of behavior. You systematically prioritized profit over patient welfare. You showed no remorse when confronted. In fact, you mocked patients who became addicted to medications you knew were dangerous. You betrayed your marriage vows while your wife grieved her dying mother. You spent your criminal proceeds on luxury items while families buried loved ones who died from overdoses related to your bribery scheme." She paused, looking at the victim families in the front row. The court has reviewed 17 victim impact statements. Parents who lost children, spouses who lost partners, families devastated by addiction that began with prescriptions written by doctors you bribed. The harm you caused is incalculable. On count 1 through 47, I sentence you to 24 years in federal prison, sentences to run consecutively. You'll be eligible for parole after serving 85% of your sentence, approximately 20 years. You're also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $4.7 million to victims and victims' families, and you're permanently banned from working in healthcare or pharmaceutical industries. 24 years. Kevin would be 62 years old when he was released. His entire adult life destroyed by his own choices. Patricia Bennett was crying quietly. Jessica wasn't present. The divorce had been finalized the week before, and she'd apparently chosen to stay away. Kevin's face was blank, shock replacing whatever emotion he might have felt. As the bailiffs led him away, Kevin glanced back one final time, not at his mother, not at his former colleagues or friends who'd testified on his behalf, at me. I met his eyes, offering no comfort, no forgiveness, just the reality of accountability. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. I'd agreed to give one brief statement, coordinated with Agent Rodriguez and the U.S. Attorney's Office. Today's sentence represents justice for the patients and families harmed by Kevin Bennett's crimes, I said, reading from a prepared statement. This case should send a clear message to anyone in the pharmaceutical industry. Patient welfare must come before profit. Corruption will be exposed. Criminals will be held accountable. And whistleblowers who report wrongdoing will be protected and vindicated. How do you feel about your ex-husband's sentence? A reporter called out. I looked directly at the camera. I feel that justice has been served, not because I wanted revenge, but because 24 years is appropriate accountability for someone whose crimes contributed to patient deaths and widespread addiction. My hope is that this case prevents others from making similar choices. Tyler drove me home, both of us silent until we reached my apartment. Is it over now? He asked gently. Yes, I said. It's finally over. 18 months after Kevin's sentencing, I stood at the podium of a healthcare ethics conference in Boston, delivering the keynote address on corporate accountability and whistleblower protection. The audience, healthcare executives, compliance officers, pharmaceutical representatives, listened with rapt attention as I described what I'd discovered and how I'd responded. Accountability isn't about revenge, I told them. It's about ensuring that systems work correctly, that vulnerable people are protected, and that people who cause harm face consequences proportional to that harm. My professional life had transformed dramatically. Morrison Healthcare Solutions had promoted me to Executive Vice President of Compliance and Ethics, a newly created position designed to prevent exactly the kind of corruption Kevin had participated in. I'd testified before congressional committees about pharmaceutical industry oversight, consulted with the FDA on prescription monitoring systems, and become a sought-after speaker on corporate ethics. Tyler and I had married 6 months ago, a small ceremony with close friends and family. His steady presence throughout the entire ordeal had proven what partnership actually meant. Supporting without controlling, encouraging without diminishing, standing beside without trying to rescue. Patricia Bennett had become an unexpected ally. She'd started a foundation focused on supporting families affected by pharmaceutical industry corruption, using the painful lessons of Kevin's crimes to create something constructive. We spoke monthly, maintaining a relationship built on shared commitment to accountability rather than family obligation. Jessica had returned to nursing, working in addiction treatment. According to mutual acquaintances, she'd gone through her own reckoning about her choices, entering therapy and taking responsibility for her role in the affair, even if she hadn't known about Kevin's crimes. I'd never spoken to her directly since the divorce and didn't intend to, but I hoped she'd found some measure of peace. Kevin was serving his sentence at a federal prison in Pennsylvania. He'd appealed his conviction, arguing ineffective assistance of counsel, but the appeal had been denied. He'd reached out once, 6 months into his sentence, with a letter delivered through his attorney. The letter had been surprisingly honest. No excuses, no attempts to shift blame. Just an acknowledgement that he'd destroyed his own life, hurt countless people, and understood that he deserved every year of his sentence. He'd asked nothing from me. No forgiveness, no contact, no softening of consequences. Just wanted me to know that he finally understood what he'd lost. I'd read the letter once, then filed it away without responding. Some things don't require a response. Some accountability stands alone. The pharmaceutical industry had changed in the wake of the case. Vanguard Pharmaceuticals had filed for bankruptcy, its assets liquidated to pay victim restitution and legal settlements. Other pharmaceutical companies had implemented stricter compliance measures, hiring independent ethics monitors, and creating transparent reporting systems for sales practices. Congress had passed legislation, informally called the Bennett Bill, requiring pharmaceutical companies to publicly disclose all payments to healthcare providers above a minimal threshold. The law had teeth, with serious penalties for non-compliance and whistleblower protections for anyone reporting violations. Dr. Morrison had served 18 months in prison as part of his plea agreement, then had his medical license permanently revoked. Last I'd heard, he was working in medical device sales, a dramatic come-down from his previous career. Several other doctors Kevin had bribed faced similar fates: short prison sentences, license revocations, permanent marks on their professional reputations. The mother of the 16-year-old girl who died from a Vexanol overdose had become a powerful advocate for addiction treatment and prescription transparency. She testified before Congress, partnered with Patricia Bennett's foundation, and dedicated her grief to preventing other families from experiencing similar losses. I'd met with her several times, forming an unexpected friendship built on shared understanding of how systemic failures harm the most vulnerable. My own mother would have been proud, I thought. Not of the destruction of my marriage, but of how I'd responded to discovering corruption. She'd taught me that surviving wasn't enough. You had to thrive, fight, refuse to be diminished. At the healthcare ethics conference after my keynote, a young woman approached during the reception. She introduced herself as a pharmaceutical sales representative for a company I didn't recognize. "I just wanted to thank you," she said quietly. "My company's compliance training now uses your case as an example of what happens when you prioritize short-term profits over patient welfare. Every new employee watches a video about Kevin Bennett's crimes and conviction. It's scary and effective." "That's exactly what should happen," I replied. "The best way to prevent future Kevins is to make the consequences crystal clear." That evening, Tyler and I walked along the Boston Harbor, watching the sun set over the water. We'd planned this trip partly for the conference, partly as a delayed honeymoon, taking time to simply be together, without the weight of legal proceedings or media attention. "Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if you'd never found those texts?" Tyler asked as we sat on a bench overlooking the harbor. I considered the question. I'd probably still be married to Kevin, completely unaware he was a criminal. My mother would still be dead. Kevin would still be bribing doctors. Patients would still be getting addicted and dying. Eventually, he probably would have been caught. The FBI investigation was already underway before I reported him. But who knows how many more people would have been harmed in the meantime. "So you're saying you have no regrets?" I didn't say that. I regret that I didn't see who Kevin really was earlier. I regret the 8 years I spent building a life with someone who turned out to be fundamentally corrupt. I regret that my mother died while I was married to him, thinking I had a solid marriage and a supportive partner. I paused. But I don't regret how I responded once I understood the truth. The path from discovery to accountability was painful, but it was right. Tyler pulled me closer. "Your mom would be proud of you." "I know," I said softly. "That's what keeps me going when the press gets overwhelming, or when I question whether exposing Kevin was worth all the upheaval. I keep hearing her voice. Don't just survive. Thrive. Don't let anyone diminish you." She was right. We sat in comfortable silence, watching boats drift across the harbor. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, Kevin was serving year 2 of his 24-year sentence, learning what it meant to face actual consequences for choices he'd made. Somewhere in Columbus, families were healing from losses caused by his crimes, building new lives around holes that could never be filled. And here I was, having dismantled a criminal enterprise, testified against corruption, and rebuilt my life into something stronger and more authentic than what I'd lost. Justice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making Kevin suffer for personal satisfaction. It was about accountability, about ensuring that harm had consequences, about protecting future victims from similar corrupt systems. Kevin had promised to take care of Jessica forever. Within 1 month of their marriage, he'd been arrested, his assets seized, his freedom stripped away. His promises had been revealed as worthless. Meanwhile, I had kept every promise that mattered. The promise to my mother to refuse to be diminished. The promise to myself to speak truth regardless of cost. The promise to victims that their harm wouldn't be ignored or dismissed. "Ready for dinner?" Tyler asked, standing and offering his hand. "Absolutely," I replied, taking his hand and standing. As we walked toward the restaurant district, I felt a deep sense of peace that had been missing for years. Not because Kevin was in prison, but because I'd chosen integrity over comfort, accountability over silence, truth over convenience. Some endings are actually beginnings. The end of my marriage to Kevin had been the beginning of understanding my own strength, my capacity for strategic thinking under pressure, my commitment to justice over personal loyalty. Kevin's life was effectively over. Even when released in 20 years, he'd be an elderly felon with no career prospects, no assets, no family support. Jessica had divorced him. Patricia had focused her energy on the foundation rather than her son. His friends had disappeared when his money did. He'd have 2 decades in federal prison to reflect on how he destroyed everything: his marriage, his freedom, his mother's respect, his wife's trust, all for money he couldn't even keep. And I would spend those same 20 years building, creating, thriving, becoming the woman my mother knew I could be, refusing to let anyone's betrayal or cruelty define my limits. That was the difference between us. Kevin had destroyed himself through his own choices. I had rebuilt myself through deliberate, principled action. As Tyler and I settled into dinner at a Harborview restaurant, I raised my glass in a silent toast, not to Kevin's downfall, but to the fierce, uncompromising woman my mother had raised me to be. The woman who'd chosen justice over silence, accountability over comfort, truth over loyalty to people who didn't deserve it. Kevin had learned exactly what he'd lost when he betrayed me. Not just a wife, but a formidable opponent who understood that some things matter more than family loyalty or protecting reputations. He'd lost everything. And I'd gained clarity, strength, and the absolute certainty that I'd done exactly what needed to be done. Justice served. Life rebuilt. No regrets.